In today's episode, we are diving into the disturbing case of Eric Smith, a troubled young boy whose heinous crime shocked a small community in the United States. Along this journey, we will uncover the twisted path that led Eric Smith down a dark and tragic road and honor the precious life of Derrick Robie, a life taken far too soon. I'm Stephanie Moram, and this is Wicked Ever After. It was a warm summer morning in the quiet town of Savona, New York. Children were enjoying their summer break, playing in the streets, and savoring their carefree days. In that small town, the biggest worry was who was going to have the biggest sunburn, cleaning up popsicle stains, and making sure everyone was home in time for dinner. Life was simple, peaceful, but little did they know that their happy world was about to be shattered by a brutal act of violence. On the morning of August 2nd, 1993, 4-year-old Derrick Robie was getting ready to head to a summer recreation program at the park down the street from his home. It was a routine walk he had taken many times before. On a typical day, Derrick's mom would bring him on the walk down the street to the park. But on this particular day, Derrick's baby brother was being a little fussy, and mom was struggling to juggle getting Derrick to the park while also attending to his younger brother. Likely noting that his mom was frazzled, Derrick told his mom that he could just take the short walk alone since he was familiar with the way. His mom allowed him to walk down the street to his program, not realizing that this would be the first and last time he would ever make that walk again. The short walk consisted of only one block, no streets to cross, and the park sat on a dead-end street, so it seemed to be a pretty safe walk for a 4-year-old. Shortly after agreeing, Derrick's mom kissed her son goodbye, shared an "I love you," and sent him on his way. Little did she know that was the last time she would ever see her son alive, for on this day, Derrick Robie would never return home. Armed with his lunch in a canvas bag, Derrick began his walk when 13-year-old Eric Smith rode his bike down the same street. Eric approached Derrick, asking if he wanted to take a shortcut to the summer program. Derrick refused, knowing he wasn't supposed to deviate from the path, but Eric was very persistent and kept asking. After the third request, Derrick gave in and said, "Okay." Having finally convinced Derrick, Eric got off his bike and led Derrick to a wooded area that sat adjacent to the park. This particular area was very secluded, covered in trees, and hidden from the view of anyone passing by. Once they reached the woods and were out of sight, Derrick dropped his bike and choked Derrick from behind with his right arm. Derrick dropped his lunch bag and fought back as hard as he could. Remember, Derrick is only 4 years old and he's going against a 13-year-old boy, yet somehow was making some ground against him by kicking his feet and swinging his fists. While trying to escape, Derrick began gasping for air, prompting Eric to squeeze harder and harder. After about 30 seconds of this, Eric could no longer hear any sounds coming from Derrick. So he assumed he was dead, prompting him to lay Derrick on the wooded ground. Shortly after he laid him on the ground, Derrick began gasping for air. Panicking, Eric dumped the contents of Derrick's lunch bag on the ground, found a napkin, and stuffed it in Derrick's mouth. When that didn't work, he grabbed a plastic bag and attempted to put that in his mouth as well, but was unsuccessful because Derrick bit his finger. With Derrick still alive, Eric became very desperate, picking up a small rock and striking Derrick 3 times in the head. To make sure the job was really done, he then picked up a larger rock and with both hands threw it on Derrick's head an additional 3 times. Then he picked up another large rock and threw it twice on Derrick's chest and once on his midsection. Derrick was no longer trying to breathe. What happened next is a mixture of juvenile and cruel events. Eric grabbed the Kool-Aid from Derrick's lunch and proceeded to pour it on all of his wounds that were caused by the force of the rocks. Then, in a strange move, Eric took the banana from the lunchbox and smashed it on the ground. He then grabbed a stick, pulled down Derrick's pants, flipped his body over, and, quote, put the stick up his butt, end quote. After completing that horrific act, Eric flipped Derrick's body back over, dragged him to a rock pile, and left him in the woods.
He said he knelt down by Derrick, and right in the right part area where he had hit him with his rocks all these times, he said 3, hit him in the head and there was some blood there. He took the Kool-Aid, and he did his hands like this, he said. So he took the Kool-Aid, and I poured it into those cuts. Those are his words. I poured it into the cuts. I said, what forever did you do that for? I don't know, I just did.
I can't imagine what poor little Derrick endured at the hands of Eric after listening to the detective describe what happened. After 5 or so minutes had passed, Eric decided to return to the scene of the crime because, according to what Derrick would later tell the police, he wanted to double check to make sure Derrick was dead. He was worried that if Derrick had somehow still been alive, he might say something or be able to identify Eric. Since Derrick was still there and still not breathing, Eric knew he had nothing to worry about. So this time he walked away for good, as if nothing had happened. Soon after Derrick had left for his summer program, a storm began to roll in. According to a 48-hour special that aired after Derrick's death, Derrick's mom, Derrick Robie, stated that she experienced an awful feeling in her stomach when the storm clouds appeared that morning. Following that feeling, Derrick raced to the park to pick up Derrick and was told that he had never arrived. I can't imagine the feeling she must have felt when she realized Derrick never arrived at the summer program. Doreen believes that when she experienced that moment of panic, that was the moment that Derrick had died, proving just how strong a mom's intuition can often be. Shortly after 11 a.m., Doreen reported Derrick missing. As panic and concern gripped the town, law enforcement launched a desperate search for Derrick. The community came together, combing the area and hoping for the best, but tragically, their worst fears were soon confirmed. 5 hours later, at 3:45 p.m., Derrick's little body was found in a small patch of woods, laying flat on his back on top of a small rock pile, not far from his own front door. His face was angled so he could look up, and his shorts and underwear were pulled down to his knees. Shock and horror ripped through the community, leaving parents terrified and seeking answers. The immediate assumption was that Derrick's killer was an adult from out of town. While worried parents in Savona kept their children inside, police began searching for possible suspects and information that could lead to an arrest. Over the next few days, investigators interviewed up to 500 witnesses. Many they interviewed more than once. 3 days after the murder, on August 5th, the police spoke to Eric. During the interview with police, Eric stated he was in and out of the park several times during the morning of August 2nd, but never saw Derrick. However, he changed his story later that day when he was questioned a second time by investigators who came to his home to clarify some discrepancies between his story and other witnesses. This time, Eric revealed he did in fact see Derrick on the opposite side of the street while riding his bike. While recounting these events, Eric was able to describe Derrick's clothing and lunch bag in great detail, causing investigators to scratch their head and be very skeptical of this story. You see, Eric wore glasses, and at the time, his glasses were broken. So how was he able to see those distinct details from the opposite side of the street? They just had a gut feeling he knew more he was letting on, but didn't actually suspect that he was the murderer. Later on in the same interview, Eric became very emotional and spontaneously asked, "You think I killed him, don't you?" To which the police replied, "No." When police asked Eric if he had seen anything else, Eric said, "I'm not the type of person that would hurt, kill, or SA anyone." Shortly after, Eric's great-grandfather, a retired sheriff's deputy, asked that the officers leave, ending the interview. Wanting to gather more details, the police, as well as the district attorney, later returned to Eric's home on the same day to ask more questions. They told his great-grandfather they were not accusing Eric, but wanted to make sure they got all the facts and details from the one witness who was the last to see Derrick alive. After some convincing, the family agreed to have Eric go with the police to McCoy Street, where Eric last saw Derrick. They were hoping to reenact Eric's movements so they could gather every detail possible. During the reenactment, Eric pointed out where he had last seen Derrick, but in an odd twist of fate, could only make out the outline of the investigator that was playing the role of Derrick. This stoked more skepticism on how Eric was able to see such vivid details that he had earlier reported about Derrick's clothing and lunch bag. It soon became dark, and the parties agreed to return the next morning. The following morning, Eric and his great-grandfather returned for another reenactment, and this time the investigators came with a video camera because they wanted to capture it all on film. But it became obvious that Eric could not have seen all that he had detailed the previous day from the distance he claimed to be, when he couldn't even see or describe an object that an officer was carrying who was portraying Derrick. The interview continued at the station with Eric and his great-grandfather, but they were no further along than they were before. Investigators didn't believe 100% what Eric was saying about Derrick on August 2nd. They didn't believe that he actually saw him. They were very skeptical of him. However, Eric's family felt that he did know something about Derrick and what had happened to him. They felt that perhaps someone was threatening him into silence, which is why he wasn't saying anything too concrete. 6 days after the murder of Derrick, on August 8th, 1990, members of Eric's family sat down and begged him to tell them what he knew. But perhaps this is an example of being careful what you ask for, because the truth was more terrifying than they had ever imagined. Eric told his mom, grandfather, and great-grandfather that he had killed Derrick. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. I killed that little boy." After the chilling confession, Eric's great-grandfather arranged a meeting with the district attorney, Tooney, at the Subin County office building. Eric was put through the normal procedures and read his Miranda rights. Throughout the ordeal, the only question he asked was, "What's an attorney?" BCI Captain DeLapp took Eric's statement. The stepfather and great-grandfather waived their rights to a lawyer. 5 days after he was killed, Derrick was buried in his baseball uniform, and just 2 days later, his killer had confessed. On August 9th, 1993, Eric was arrested for the murder of Derrick Robie. So how did we get here? What drove a 13-year-old kid to murder an innocent 4-year-old that he had never even met? Perhaps the picture becomes a little more clear when we dive into the complexities of Eric's life that had come to light during the investigation and the trial following Derrick's murder. Born on January 22, 1980, Eric Smith entered the world with hopes and dreams and possibilities. He was later adopted when he was a baby by Ted Smith. During Tammy Smith's pregnancy, his mother, she took a drug called triadone to control her epilepsy. Later, it was found that this drug could cause severe birth defects such as malformed ears, cleft palate, heart issues, and skeletal abnormalities, as well as physical and mental delays. It also carried the warning label, "Termination of pregnancy should be considered," meaning if you took this drug, termination of the pregnancy should be considered. The drug may have caused Eric's ears to be low set and may have contributed to his developmental delays, which profoundly affected his self-esteem. He began walking and talking around the age of 2, but had a speech impediment and actually drooled while speaking until he was 9 years old. He struggled in school. He was actually in grade 5 as a 14-year-old boy, and he was bullied excessively for his appearance. With bright red hair and freckles, Eric was often seen around town riding his bike for hours all alone, suggesting he didn't have any friends and was often alone. During the trial, it was revealed that he had difficulty expressing himself, which led to behavioral problems, including severe temper tantrums and banging his head against random things. He was also very impulsive and didn't always understand the consequences of his actions. This led to even more bullying and isolation. Ted Smith, his father, was also aggressive towards Eric and admits to have hit him several times with a belt. This all further deepened his troubled psyche, perhaps paving the way for the crime he would later commit. According to a Dateline episode in 1994, two neighbors reported Eric exhibiting bizarre behaviors.
They were both sleeping in the living room. My son took the recliner and Eric took the couch. And evidently my son fell asleep, but Eric didn't, because my son said he had woke up with a burning feeling, something hot. And when he totally woke up, Eric had a lit cigarette laying on his nose. He'd burned his face with the cigarette.
When Eric was about 9, he used a clamp from a vacuum cleaner to slowly strangle the cat to death.
At one point during his childhood, Eric told his father, Tim, that he needed help. His father told him that when he was a kid, he would punch a punching bag when he was angry and upset. So Eric took his advice, left the house, and came back with bloody knuckles. Ted Smith recounts the story. I heard a door shut, and I turned around, and he was gone. And as I got to the window, he was coming back in the house, and he was calm. And I looked down and noticed his knuckles and his hands were kind of beat up and bloody. I asked him what happened, and he said, I hit the tree a couple of times. He looked okay, according to his father. It seems when Eric asked for help with his anger, his adoptive father wasn't equipped to give it to him. Defense psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Herman diagnosed Eric with intermittent explosive disorder and uncontrollable rage. Literally deadly rage and anger, said Dr. Herman. Intermittent explosive disorder is a behavioral disorder characterized by explosive outbursts of anger and or violence, often to the point of rage that are disproportionate to the situation at hand. This could present itself as impulsive shouting, screaming, or excessive reprimanding triggered by relatively inconsequential events. However, the prosecution's expert wasn't buying it and said it was a rare disorder that was rarely seen at Eric's age. Eric was subjected to extensive medical testing from specialists from both sides. They examined brain function and hormone levels and found nothing to explain his violent behavior. But Dr. Herman still believed there was something wrong. Something happened to his brain, he said, but we can't measure it. He claimed that Eric's pain and rage overwhelmed him. Dr. Herman went on to say that he wasn't suggesting that the drug used during pregnancy would have caused Eric to be violent, but he does believe the drug caused Eric's ears to be low set and caused his developmental delays, which profoundly affected his self-esteem. On September 2nd, 1993, a grand jury indicted 13-year-old Eric Smith on second-degree murder charge. Eric was tried as an adult. A year later, in August 1994, Eric stood trial for the murder of Derrick Robie. The prosecution presented a chilling case, relying on Eric's confession, physical evidence, and testimony from witnesses who saw Eric in the area around the time of the crime. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Eric's troubled childhood and mental health issues should be taken into account. On August 19, 1994, a jury deliberated and returned a verdict that would have lasting consequences. Having accepted the prosecution's argument that Eric was not suffering from any extreme mental disorder that controlled his actions at the time of the murder, the jury found Eric Smith, at the age of 14, guilty of second-degree murder. On November 7, 1994, he was sentenced to the maximum term allowed for a juvenile offender, a minimum of 9 years to life in prison. He began his sentence at a juvenile detention facility operated by the state for youth. When he turned 21, he was then transferred to an adult correctional facility to serve the remainder of his sentence. Throughout this time in prison, Eric maintained a low profile, rarely speaking about his crime. Over the years, he pursued education, earned degrees, and participated in therapy, leading some to question whether he had truly rehabilitated. In 2002, after serving 8 years in prison, Eric Smith was eligible for parole. His case sparked intense debate within the community and stirred up painful memories for Derrick Robie's family. On June 11th, 2002, Eric Smith had his first chance at parole, but it was denied. The parole board noted the 22-year-old appeared to have little remorse for murdering Derrick Robie. He would have many chances every 2 years to apply for parole. In June of 2004, parole was denied a second time. Fast forward to April 2014. Eric had another parole hearing. This time, he told the parole board that at the time of the murder, he was angry and that he'd been abused by family and bullied by classmates, stating that he was taking out his frustrations on 4-year-old Derrick Robie. He didn't deserve anything that I did to him. No one deserves that kind of violence, he stated during the hearing. What I did to him was brutal. I took my anger and frustration and rage out on him. He assured the board that those emotions weren't directed at Derrick, but rather at his father, older sister, and the high schoolers who bullied him. I took it out on Derrick, and he did not deserve that. Despite Eric's claims of remorse and the effort at self-improvement, the parole board denied his release again, citing the horrific nature of his crime and concern over his potential threat to society. At the final parole hearing on October 5th, 2021, Eric yet again pleaded his case to a board that had denied his release multiple times before. During his hearing, he explained, "No one deserves that type of violence. At the end, I was holding a lot of anger and unresolved issues with a lot of individuals that I lashed out at, and I displaced my anger that was unresolved with other individuals on him. It should never have happened. And as to why, after years of reflection, looking at who I was then and what was going on, I essentially became the bully that I disliked in everyone else in my life. I was constantly being targeted for being weaker and smaller, and I became the bully towards him, and he didn't deserve it." Eric went on to say Derrick could have been a lawyer, he could have been a teacher, causing more students to be better men and women as they get older. All the different things that he could have done professionally in those areas, I took from him because of my own selfishness and wanting to lash out instead of speaking to someone who could have given me help. Derrick's parents, Doreen and Dale Robie, were both still living at the time of Eric's parole and objected to the idea that he could be freed and return to live in the community. They were still keenly aware of his actions 3 decades later, and for them, the senseless murder of their son was still as fresh as it was the day it occurred. In his final plea, Eric acknowledged the grieving parents and stated, "I'm not the same person. And while that in and of itself doesn't take away their anguish and pain, I would hope to convey to them that while I am remorseful, I realize the depths to some extent because I can't truly understand the depth of how Derrick's mom feels. I can never fully understand the depths of how Derrick's father feels." On November 7th, 2021, Eric Smith was granted parole after 27 years in federal prison. The parole board based their decision on multiple factors, citing Eric's clean record, strong release plan, and low scores on his risk assessment. In February 2022, Eric was officially released from the Woodbourne Correction Facility and became a free man with supervised parole. Now 44 years old as of 2023, Smith reportedly resides in Queens, New York, nearly 300 miles southeast of the small Savona village where he was raised and committed the violent crime. After Eric's release, in an interview with CBS 48 Hours, Doreen Robie told the show, "I understand after so many years they decided to give him a chance, and that's fine for him and his family." Later on, she stated, "He's been released, but in a way, so have we. No more parole. We can get on with our lives. Now the true healing can begin." The case of Eric Smith raises challenges and questions about the nature of juvenile crime, rehabilitation, and the justice system. It serves as a haunting reminder that evil can exist even within the youngest among us and leaves us pondering the complexities of human behavior. The behavior we may never fully understand, but might we ourselves fall victim to. Please let me know what you think in the comments. If you found this story interesting, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube or whatever podcasting platform you are listening on. You can stay connected with me on Instagram and TikTok at This is Stephanie Moram. Join me next time as we continue our exploration of true crime, delving into the depths of the human psyche and shining a light on the darkest corners of society. Until then, stay safe and take a quick moment to remember the sweet soul of Derrick Robie and all that he could have been.